Welcome to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hi, welcome back to the Soul Grit podcast. This is Ann, and I'm here today with first ever team of 3 guests. And these are some authors and friends of mine who are coming out with a new book today. So first of all, let's welcome back to the podcast my friend Gary Kwan. Hi, Gary.
Hi, good to see you.
Gary was on the podcast about 3 years ago to talk to us about mental health in the context of incarceration, because Gary has done a lot of work in county jails and had a lot of experience there. But over the years, he has also increased his portfolio in the field of mental health. And today, he's back here today to talk about Asian American experiences in mental health. And so because of that, and the new book that's coming out, he's invited 2 of his co-authors. So let's first say hi to Ari. Hi, Ari.
Hello, Ann. How's it going?
Good. And so Ari is from Washington, and she is an advocate for mental health and a contributor to the book. And then we also have James. Hi, James.
Hi, Ann. How are you?
Good. And so the one thing that James and I have in common is that we have the same alma mater, along with Gary. We all went to Western Seminary for our marriage and family therapy degree, and James is in his process of working towards licensure. So we all have a little bit different position in the field, I would say, like a different role in the field right now. But we all are coming at this with the idea that mental health matters, your cultural experience matters, your faith matters in that. So let's get into it. Gary, why don't you introduce us to the new book that's coming out?
The book, it's called Asian American Chronicles, Tales of Mental Health and Hope. Can't wait to share some of the stories behind it, but the story behind the title itself took quite a few iterations, and so I credit the team for corralling what seemed to be a disparate amount of opinions about the title, mainly because in the culture we want to get it right the first time. Mm-hmm. There's this notion of perfectionism and showing good face and good competency, and so I think there was a lot of both tedium but also carefulness in which we approached coming up with the title. And if I might launch into sort of the genesis of this book, originally I've been working on a book, given that I probably share similar humors to the show host, on my worst mistakes clinically and learning from those mistakes. And I was 2 chapters in. One of the chapters, which may or not still make it into that book, was around falling asleep during a session.
Gary.
And having worked too much and not taking care of myself. And self-care would be another topic. But then sometime in 2022, on an airplane ride back from taking care of my sister's kids in Orlando at the time, and they've since moved to New Jersey, God just spoke to me and said, "You've got to write this book." And so I, as a late adopter to new technologies, I tried to vet this book with my wife, Emily, with my brother-in-law, Rudy. We had a lot of serious heart-to-heart talks as brothers-in-law. And in that sense, I'm grateful for that, because we would just have these spots of tea in some Davis cafes late at night on Friday night when the kids were asleep, and just talking about why this book needed to be written. Mm. And that as the end of spring 2023 came around, the thought was to, my main goals with the book, one is clinical, to bring forth more mental health knowledge and understanding to the readership, whoever they may be. Second piece of it was more of an aggressive or assertive approach, which is to uplift other people in their early careers. And I'm only here because of one professor at Western Seminary who no longer works there, as well as someone that may or may not be familiar to the show host, Ann, but is very well known in the Christian community here, as a champion for people's careers. And so I wanted to have an ability to uplift people's careers. And then third, which is essentially to launch more specific ministry-oriented offerings on top of therapy, individual therapy or group therapy offerings. So it's very ambitious, and that's why it's probably taken as long as it has. And particularly it was finding the right group of people to invite. And as we all know as Christians, sometimes my moments are not in line with what God wants. And so it's been a lot of submitting myself in that process to the right people and the right occasions. And so, I'm proud, fingers crossed, but also hopeful to God that this will turn live in the next 72 hours or so. But in the meantime, we produced a proof for the book, and it's been largely well received by those that have looked at bits and pieces of it so far. But we can't wait to James and Ari and the rest of the team. We can't wait to show it off to our folks, right? And our folks is literally everyone. But I have one staff member or one team member that has not shown her family what she's been working on, so she can't wait to show the book to her spouse and the kiddos. So that's that.
Great. So Gary, when you first got the idea and you're saying like God put it on your heart to that this is your next assignment, did you know that it was going to be a collaboration, or did you think you'd like, this is a big thing to bite off that I have to do myself?
I think a lot of times in my career, in the past interview, I really went about the approach in the way that I thought as Gary Kwan, I should help out with criminal justice reform. And I'm going to show people and I'm going to demonstrate this, and recidivism rates going down. And I think it was a truly humbling moment because it wasn't as well received in the jail system as I thought it might be. And it came across as both one part hubris and one part showing up folks. And so there's a section in the Chinese chapter in the book that literally goes back to when I was trying to show off my high school medals and my academic achievement things, and my mom ripped them off the wall and off the chair and said, we're not going to show up your sisters. And so I think that was one of the more humbling pieces of it. And so I thought this approach would end up being far more measured, as well as trying to find the right people for the right chapters. And so while I have a very strong clinical knowledge base and my own developmental trauma history, what I felt was that this was a good occasion to bring forth other people's stories. And that's why we call it in the title Tales, because these are stories that I think will resonate, particularly with perhaps the female readership, but also those that may be suffering and wanting help for their kids or for their spouses. Or in my case, I'm getting more requests for family therapy to solve Vietnamese problems, Korean problems, Japanese problems, you name it. So I think that it's been a real thing to follow God in the process while also fighting him a lot of the time, and knowing that he ultimately will triumph, rightfully so, but also in my best interest.
Well, here's a question for all three of you to jump in as needed. But Gary just mentioned, like, in family therapy, he's working on Vietnamese problems, Japanese problems, Korean problems. Are there such things? Or is it just all family problems and we have different contexts? Like, what are things that are specific to our cultures?
Well, I think there are similarities, and there are a lot of similarities, a lot of big themes, right, for Asian American families, adults and children. And at the same time, I think one of the biggest things that we've seen in our society today is this overall bucketing of Asian Americans, right? Seeing an Asian American, it's like, oh, you're Chinese, right? Or, oh, you must be Japanese, or whatever it is. But really they just kind of look at us as, okay, we're somehow one single cell organism. And what this book is really about is kind of highlighting that there are different shades of us, right? There are different cultures within the Asian American culture. There's different people with different backgrounds and different traditions. There are similarities across, which is why this is the Asian American Chronicles. But at the same time, we want to highlight some of the things that are more personal to each category, I guess, or each folk that is under, either Japanese or Vietnamese or Chinese, right? Because of different geological locations, but also that cultural and familial background, right, that we want to bring into this.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to also add that, yeah, I was just stated, it isn't a one size fits all, but there are themes. I think there are definitely themes, and this is an AAPI book, which we've come to recognize. There are some central themes that look maybe not identical, but very similar, and the traditional Asian of humility, hard work, servanthood, discipline, you know, obey your elders, those kind of authoritarianism and meekness, especially. So it's that realm that I think um, a an Asian American therapist such as Gary could speak on these behalfs and centralize his sessions around and help him. And even though he's may not be Japanese per se, so.
Mm.
One of the interesting things is tonight, it will be my first session, but also it could be my last session with a Vietnamese specific family where they're saying, and I think all of us that are in the room that are therapists and on the podcast will probably know that the person that's the most ready to change and possibly healthiest is the one that's going to be calling in for therapy, which also means in particularly Asian communities that when it comes to helping out someone that might have a severe mental illness, that the players involved are very helpless to be able to help out, right? And so in this case, there might be, well, we're just going to dedicate all of our resources to help out this one person, when in fact that may be the least helpful thing for someone that might have a diagnosis like schizophrenia or bipolar, or might need an outside helper with managing their finances. And so I think what separates us from, let's say, the more Americanized communities or more non-Asian communities is the familiarity and the more recent introduction of mental health services. And while sure that I think there was this thing that went around when you and I were in school, and we had this Asian American therapist directory, and it read very much like a bunch of retired engineers that happened to I'm not trying to clown on their careers, but a lot of retired engineers that chose a second career to help out people.
Mm.
And what I'm discovering with especially the authors of the book, they all have their own stories that have guided them towards their own therapy work, but also that it'll be meaningfully used for the betterment of other people. And a lot of it's just that stigmatization is still there, but there's also what happens is with confidentiality and our cases not being talked about. When I was working for a local hospital for parts of COVID, what I saw was pretty alarming, both in the inpatient units, that I would see a lot of people that looked like myself and looked forlorn, lost, anguished, and really out of sorts. And that was often either first psychotic break, a first introduction to not even heavy drugs, but like, let's say, more potent strains of marijuana, etc. And then when I started working in intensive outpatient programs, it was also a lot of people that looked like ourselves, meaning Ari and James. And oftentimes, just in the group setting dynamic, they would feel like their problems would not be in comparison to other people's problems. And so there was this sort of like diminishment of my own struggles in the sense of like the wider diaspora of the group. And so one of the local agencies I used to work for, or that I still work for part-time, they asked me to do individual therapy with AAPI folks so that they could hop back into the group and find support and have that vulnerability. But I'm saying that it's a lot of things that were not taught in grad school for sure, that I was not prepared for. But as I was doing my criminal justice work, the same type of patient or the same background of patient kept on showing up in my office, and it was usually AAPI's individuals, couples, families. I have someone that did work with me that is in a biracial relationship, but they are Asian, and so like I'm saying that the one thing that came through was people that looked and acted like me. And though there are a lot of good books and wonderful books that are out there dedicated to trauma and migratory stuff, what I felt was that there needed to be an entry on my and my colleagues' behalf to just say that we have this entry that covers these 12 items. So in that sense, it kind of has that Asianness of like, well, we're not going to be the best bakery, but we'll be the other bakery that's also there that happens to serve the best stuff as well. So in that sense, it's a humble offering, and I hope it's perceived as humble.
Okay. Well, Gary, why don't you walk us through what is in the book? Can you give us an outline?
Yes. Walking through the table of contents, and again, this will obviously be in the books that are purchased for everyone. But the first chapter is an opening statement. This book essentially cemented itself during Emily and my December 2023 trip. We started in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and made our way southeast to Atlanta during our Christmas trip. And one of the important points was for us to visit certain museums that supported Black and African American culture, Native and First Nations culture. And so one of the more jarring things that we saw was a particular exhibit in Tulsa, Oklahoma, dedicated to the first Black Wall Street that was destroyed and obliterated and basically not remembered and not put in our history books. And so there's a famous TikTok out there by Tom Hanks that talks about it, like, why did I never learn about this incident that happened? And so that was a real sort of eye-opening cultural thing, but it also doubled back on my desire to write something like this, because there doesn't exist this other than anecdotal stories shared among colleagues or people consulting with each other in clinical settings. And so we wanted to have a book that had its rightful place, but also didn't cover just one topic, sort of topic du jour, which is in this case trauma. Our opening chapter is a combo chapter written by T-Van and Ari, who's on our podcast here, called Migratory Trauma and Acculturation. And then we sort of lurch into some real big problematic issues in our community. One is a failure to launch. And so one thing that's happening both here on the West Coast, but also in Canada, of all places, is a failure to launch of Asian sons. And so there have been anecdotal stories both coming out of Vancouver, Toronto, and people we've talked to in Canada, in parts all throughout the East, as well as the central part, of the sons not being able to live on their own. And so they're often living at home with their parents well into their 30s, 40s, and 50s. Then I have a chapter on sailing the choppy seas of life's transitions, and this was a concerted effort on my part to address why we aren't preparing ourselves for the next life stage, and instead, sort of from an anxious standpoint, just trying to finish the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. I recall one of my youth group kids would always ask me what the next age range looked and felt like to me, so that he could find out about it, as opposed to experiencing it on his own. And then we have a chapter on severe mental illness. I think a chapter called Severe Mental Illness would not have gone over very well with the readership, and so we call it The Young Ones We Are Worried About, because one of the most important things culturally in AAPI cultures is our children. And so it's a very informative chapter on what to do if our children encounter bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, schizophrenia, delusional disorders, and etc. And then I have a chapter specifically on non-death grief and why does it hurt so much. And then we go into my original goal for the book was to have specific ethnic chapters, and some of the chapters unfortunately fell through for this first edition. We really had hoped to have a South Asian chapter, which is obviously relevant in our part of the world, in California, but also a Filipino American chapter. But I'm hoping to secure those folks for the next edition. Okay. But nevertheless, we have a Vietnamese American chapter by T-Van, a Korean American chapter by our colleague Wish. I wrote the Chinese American chapter, but I would say, and I'm not being humble about this, that within our friend group or colleague group, there probably exists 2 or 3 just as powerful and invigorating stories in the Chinese American community. And I hope that those eventually take over this particular chapter. And then the one I think will be interesting to hear about from James is an Asian Christian chapter, given that everyone on this podcast is Christian, and I think the podcast audience is largely Christian as well. And then we turn to these closing topics that are supremely important, but also they're seen as kind of difficult to look at in our communities. And so one is single parenting by Ari as well. And then when our deepest relationships end, there isn't a preparatory set of speeches for when divorces happen or when our dream relationships don't turn out the way we want them to. And then finally, a chapter on, and this may be familiar to perhaps Anne the most of this call, but I took Eric Erickson's chapter on the stages of life development and converted that to something that I think might be more edible, but or I guess consumer worthy for the Asian American community, but also to look at some of the more problematic age ranges, which is our very young folks, our 21 to 30 age range, and then more lovingly, our senior ages between 60 and 80, that there's so much relational discord in our communities around just treating our elders properly, our elder parents and caregivers, but also while honoring our own commitments and our own responsibilities. And then we have a fun acknowledgments chapter to end the book. So that's a flyover of the table of contents, Anne.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I'd like to get into a little bit more of the stories behind the book, because that's really what's driving it. So if you guys are cool with it, I'd like to ask Ari to share a little bit of your story.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote partially the migratory chapter as well as the single parenting, and both of them have very similar themes where it's from storytelling perspective. And some of it is partly biographical, but really partly it's kind of common stories that I personally have seen, and in people that I've known, and as well as in stories as well, right? So it's more about storytelling. It's more about relatability around that common theme that I was talking about, which, while each different culture we have within the Asian American demographic, but there's also common themes such as immigration, right? Such as single parents, like parents and children who are in their own relationships that are single parenting, and the struggles between the two, where, like, for example, with the single parenting, I wrote this in both the perspective of the child and the perspective of the parent, right? And the idea around that is, there's obviously the immigration part of it that comes into that story, but also the common themes of, well, when you are a child of a single parent, how do you feel, right? How does that bring about your development as a child of a single parent? And then conversely, where's the parent in that, in terms of how does he or she feels about being a single parent in this situation, right? It's a hard situation for both. And what I wanted to bring out of that is really that common understanding, right? The first of all, being relatable, that people have experienced single parenting in many different aspects, but able to relate to, as a parent, to see the child's perspective, and as a child, see the parent's perspective. And how does that, that lack of understanding could lead to, greater chasms of relationship between the parent and the child. But also, as you now become a mature person, that reading this chapter hopefully helps with that understanding, and also having better, repair to that relationship, right? As a child or as a parent, to each other. So those are kind of the major themes that I want to bring into. And of course, the migratory piece is, again, that storytelling about this girl who's going through immigration, right? Not knowing what's really coming to her life exactly, right? Because when you're a child, you kind of don't know, right? You're not thinking in that way. So as a child, what does that impact look like, right? From this pure innocence of, I'm saying goodbye to my friends, I'm going to this new place, no idea what my life is going to be like, right? And then hence you go into this new life. It's new language, new people, new land. There are no family around, right? How does that feel for that person? And what are the impacts of that development for that person as they immigrated to a new land with that gap in language and culture, right? And again, that piece of it is hoping to relate to a lot of folks within the Asian American community. It doesn't matter which country that they're from, but that immigration, that feeling of immigration, that feeling of being in that new land, and helping them kind of go through that. There are impacts to that, right? That as you grow in this new country, mentally, how does that impact you as a child? But also that you don't need to have a mental health, you don't need to have a mental problem to wanting to seek help to talk through some of these, experiences that are kind of jarring, right? That are difficult, right? Let's be honest here. It's a difficult experience to immigrate to a different country, having a different language, and as a child, right? So all of those things kind of wrapped together is to encourage people to think about well, yeah, I did somewhat experience this. And yeah, this did make me feel this way. And maybe in part helps them to understand why they're struggling through certain things that they are experiencing right now, and that there is hope to find help and get through or sift through some of those feelings and impacts, right? Because it worked for this person, right? It did work for this person in this story. It's almost like a liberation of, being able to talk things out, being able to process their feelings, the difficulties, right? And we experience these difficulties throughout our lives, right? And if we're not processing them, we're internalizing them and we're feeling the impacts as people, right? So providing that hope, right? And providing that there are solutions out there on how to address certain difficulties and helping to enhance, better mental health, as those are the two specific things that I touched upon in both of these chapters.
I think one thing that hit me out of what you were saying is that you don't necessarily have to have a mental problem to want to seek help and talk to somebody about some things that you've gone through.
Exactly. Yeah. And that tends to be the misunderstanding within the Asian American culture, I want to say. And, James, Gary, feel free to chime in on this one as well, which is we see that it is something that that our cultures, doesn't matter which one, is that we have this stigma around mental health, right? As around getting therapy work or doing therapy work and getting mental health help, that it means that there's something wrong with you. But you don't need to have a problem, right? It does not mean that you have a problem and you need serious help. It aids you through a lot of the, different situations in life, and that it actually helps liberate you and helps to put you in a much healthy mindset, right? As you go about your daily lives. So we want to demystify that, right?
Ari, do you think that it produces shame in parents who have immigrated to know that their kids might have had trauma through the experience?
I cannot speak for everyone. I mean, that could be part of it, right? That could be part of it, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think. I guess I can't speak for everyone on that one. So I would invite Gary and James to kind of chime in as well if what you have seen is like that. Personally, I don't think so. So
I guess I'm thinking of my experience as a parent. I think I would be questioning myself if my child was struggling. I would say, should we have stayed in our home country instead so they wouldn't have to learn the new language? Or is it more of no, I'm providing a better life. This is better opportunities. And so they're just going to have to suck it up and deal with it.
I see more of the latter, right? I see more of the latter because I think that what I have seen typically is that we as parents, right, just speaking on behalf of parents, is that we immigrated to a different country, to America, because we want to provide better opportunities for our children, right? We're doing this for their good. So I think a lot of times that if you do see that they're struggling, or these parents are seeing struggling, is that misunderstanding of, there's got to be something about the way that they're thinking of things, right? It's not because we made a mistake about immigrating to a different country, because that's practicality standpoint, and that is it takes all the checkpoints, right? Like it's better education, better everything, right? All of those things. But this chapter, in terms of migratory chapter, is to help untangle that, and helping parents to not think of it as, okay, well, my children has some problems and mental problems that, hey, Gary or James, can you just help them to stop having these problems, right? Help them, right? It's not us, help them. It's about understanding a little bit better from the children's perspective, right? That there are certain things that they're struggling with. There is that gap in the social gap, right? There are no family around that they can go to, like an uncle or a sister, or uncle or a cousin, or, having that bigger communities, where in Asia, a lot of people are very, very family centric, and they have big families, and they have people they can turn to, their communities they can turn to. But when you immigrate to the United States, it's very different, right? It's very isolated. And, you know, just the fact that you don't have all these family and support network there for the child to grow up in, you also have that language barrier and then the cultural barrier. And this actually gets addressed in the migratory chapter, right? Where, you know, this person feels like, oh, you know, learning of there is a such thing called the personal bubble, right? Where you rarely see that in Asia, right? Everybody's in very close proximity. So you come here, it's like, oh, you don't want to get too close to another person, right? And it's not something bad, but it's a cultural difference that they have to understand. So traversing that, understanding that, growing into that, right, is difficult, right? And it's not the child's problem, right? And that is what we're trying to hope to help parents to understand that, right?
Okay. Are any of the three of you first generation?
Yeah, I'm first generation, I would say.
Yeah. What age were you when you immigrated?
About 8 years old.
8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
James and Gary, what generation are you, or do you know?
I was born in New York, and yeah, mother was born overseas in Malaysia.
Oh.
Yeah, so yeah, but I didn't really have much of a overseas influence in my upbringing. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd say I'm squarely a generation 1.5. My mom was brought over as not quite a mail order bride, but as a selected bride for my dad.
Wow.
And so I think I have nothing to add to Ari's excellent sharing. I think I bring a much more weirder vantage point, and I mean weird as in not like clinically weird, but I think the bulk of the people that I've shown through my door, there was a period, let's say in the late teens, where it was spiritual abuse or like religious trauma or church hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the last 6 years has been almost like a proliferation of all sorts of different problems. And I think that's probably why I decided on the chapters that I did. But the one thing, and I know you asked in good faith, because I know who you are as a sister in Christ, and I've also gotten these sort of, the question is innocuous, but the intent feels a little off. And it often comes across as, well, why aren't you writing a book about more Americans? I don't know if you catch that or not. So
No, I'm not catching your meaning.
So why an AAPI book? Why don't you write more about mental health for all of us? And I think for me, it comes across much more as a personal affront from where I sit, because there hasn't been a specific AAPI book. And I think part of it is, for me, I've tried very hard in my life to fit in. And what you'll see in the Chinese chapter is, like, there's times where I love being who I am, and other times where I'm this pretend wannabe hip hop guy in my teenage years, and other times I've just wanted to be an academic. And what I found, largely outside of some really good people on this podcast and you all, is that it's largely rejected by the American populace. And so my colleague, Isalamush Sendeku, she talks about America being an increasingly hostile host.
Mm.
I don't know if you catch that, but a hostile host, right? And so, so like one of my stories, and this came up actually in 2022 after I did the podcast with you. I was invited last second to go to attend a women's addiction conference. I'm not a woman, last time I checked, so that was an interesting invite. And so, so I did a brief talk, and I actually don't remember what the talk was about. It was just a very quick talk about the proliferation of drug use among kids. But one of the older women in the audience gets up and says, "Oh, you know, I work with a lot of Chinese daughters, and I love my work with them, and I feel fulfilled in this work. But why are Chinese mothers such bitches?"
Okay.
That's what, and I just stood there as stunned as you're looking right now, and I didn't have a real good sense. But this is times where sometimes my mouthpiece has to quiet and God has to speak in, and so I won't give you the exact thing I said, but I basically hinted that for that Chinese mother, who you've just called a bitch, for any number of reasons, right? So this makes me think about all of our work, like with individuals versus families. like this practitioner had not thought about how hard it was for that Chinese mother to acculturate, to assimilate, to acculturate, but really to assimilate, which is more of a forced version of it. And so why wouldn't you, if you were not allowed to be fully woman or empowered in your home country, want to subject your daughter to the same exact thing? And so I think some of it could be in the application of how we did family life. I'm going to be very hard on Ari, but I'm going to spoil James Rotten, right? I've seen versions of that sort of dynamic. Or I'm going to be very courteous to Anne and give Anne everything that Anne could ever want, and then deal with the consequences later, right? And so I think you see versions of like this wildly swinging pendulum back and forth to be super permissive or to be like, supremely authoritarian so that they can learn how to be a better American and to be more awesome. And it has worked, believe it or not, for some. But I think for this practitioner, she saw that she sees 12 to 15 Chinese women in her practice, and these are all women that have been, I think, largely liberated through this therapy practice, but also that the generation above them may not have been liberated at all because they're there. They have not maybe acculturated the way that they intended to. I have an anecdote in my chapter around a family member that regrets ever coming here, that regrets having their kids, regrets marrying who they married, right? And so I think there are different pieces to this American life that I'm trying to help people sort of cobble together in a puzzle if they stay long enough in therapy. That's the biggest thing. Not that I'm trying to have people in therapy for 30 sessions or so, but it's often not the 8 to 12 that managed healthcare tells you that people can get healed in. And the other piece, that they're the two C's, I call them the two C's. One is comparison and then competition. And so I think these two have been, if we can treat them as from a narrative perspective, two of the most damaging things about living here as an Asian American. It was always, for me, you got to be as smart as Hank. And Hank may end up listening to this, by the way, but he went to Ohio State. He went to the better school, right? How come so-and-so got to be a master's degree while you only did your bachelor's for a while? How come your master's came from a seminary, right? And so there's this comparison to like these unspoken higher ups, right? Or to the better off folks. And then also the competition thing, which is instead of seeing James and Ari as my colleagues and my brother and sister, and Anne as my sister, this dynamic happens in grad school as well, is that I really see you as competition to my therapy job or my therapy intern site. And so there's a poverty mentality around empathy and understanding and belonging. And so it really disrupts a lot of our field, which is about healthy attachment. And these things all conspire to really disrupt attachment and really knock people back into some dark places. And so in that sense, I really credit particularly Ari and James for their 2.5 chapters really do attack that sort of enemy and saying, like, this is not the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for letting me share that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so if I can add to that, which is, the part where you talked about the therapist that's seen a lot of Asian daughters and had that response about their mothers. I think one of the things about our book here is to address head on that different Asian cultures, and just, that sweeping theme is that in Asian culture, there's a method, right, to how to improve our kids, right, our kids in general in becoming better people. And there's a set formula that we tend to see over and over again, right? That it's not about being the B word, but it's about striving them to be better, right? So even though, while it doesn't work the way that it should, which is that whole competition and comparison, right, is that there's a goal to that. That goal is to make their kids better, but the impacts of that, what does that look like, right? And this book kind of helps address that. We're starting to address that to those common themes, like what is the impact on people when you do this? And that while we need to understand and credit the cultural piece of it, but we also need to understand that there are negative impacts to this that can be resolved through therapy, and that those people who are not talking about it are just internalizing it, and it's not healthy, right? So how do we kind of bring this out and think about how do we kind of not combat this, but kind of, I kind of go back to some of the courses I've taken in marriage and family therapy is around, that ego, right? That ego's there is for a good reason. It's to protect you. But at the same time, at one point in your life, you got to talk to that ego and say, hey, maybe, I understand that there's a purpose to you and it is like a positive purpose, but it might not be serving me right now. Right. So that, comparison and competition, that was a value that was being put through for our good, but we need to kind of look at that more holistically and think about, well, maybe right now it's not serving me. Right. And here's how I can kind of help myself to get past that, right? Culturally.
Yeah. Gary, just to address what you're saying, I feel thankful that you're writing an AAPI book. Like, you're the most qualified person I know to do it. I mean, within my circle, at least, like, I would want to hear what you say about that, because I think if I were to reflect on my own experience, like, obviously you can tell by my skin color, my hair color, my accent, I'm dominant culture, right? But the subculture that I belong to is the Christian culture, right? And if I were to write a book on my mental health expertise or something like that, it would be addressing my subculture, right? I'm not going to write some clinical theory book or some methodology book on some kind of counseling theory unless I'm addressing it specifically to my culture, which is church girls, like that's who I'm talking to. So I totally respect why you want this book to be out there and why you want to share these experiences. And I think this would be probably a good place for us to transition. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up this part of the conversation, but I want our listeners to know that there is a part 2 of this conversation that will be released after this. And what we're going to do specifically in part 2 of the conversation is to talk to James more specifically about his chapter, which is Asian plus Christian, because we know a lot of Asian people come from different religious backgrounds, but there is a very specific quality to being Asian and Christian. It'll have its own flavor versus like me, dominant culture Christian, or Asian and not Christian. So we're going to talk specifically about that. So I would invite everybody to tune back in next time for the Soul Grit podcast.
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.